Welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers, and in this episode I want to talk about fictional truth and secondary worlds in traditional fiction, but especially in interactive fiction. So, what do I mean when I say fictional truth? I'll get there in a moment, but I want to get there by way of discussing, once again, the game that I put center stage in a previous episode, 905 by Adam Cadre. Just like last time, I will completely spoil this little interactive fiction game, so if you would like to play it unspoiled, please pause this video now and return later. Let's start by asking this question. What is the story of 905? Well, since it is an interactive piece with multiple endings, there's no simple answer to that question. What happens in the story, how it ends, depends on what you do. But if you are a first-time player, you are very likely to end up seeing the following piece of text, which summarizes what you, as the protagonist, have been doing. A burglar broke into an East Las Mesas home, killed the owner, and stashed his body under the bed, put his possessions in the trunk of his car, and then fell asleep, woke up the next morning, went to his victim's office and tried to do the victim's job. No doubt 905 is one of very few works of fiction that end with a summary of the action, and one of even fewer where this summary is actually surprising to the player. The whole conceit of 905 as a game is that a player will just assume that they wake up in their own apartment and that they then need to go to work. Of course, it turns out that the facts of the case are a bit different. Of course, once they've realized this, most players will restart the game and replay for a different ending. You'll still be a burglar who broke into an East Las Mesas home, killed the owner and so forth, but instead of going to the victim's office and get arrested, the winning ending involves you driving off into the sunset with your ill-gotten loot. But here is something that happened to Philip Racek when he recently played 905. He played through the apartment in the usual way, not finding out about the corpse underneath the bed or any of the other pieces of evidence for the crime. Then he got into the car, but instead of stopping at the Loungent Technologies office, he rode on and got the winning ending to appear on the screen. The ending that goes like this. You merge onto the freeway, crank up the radio, and vanish without a trace. You have left Las Mesas. What I'm interested in this video is the question, did Philip read a story about a man who was fed up with his job? Or did he, without realizing it, read a story about a homicidal burglar? Here's another way to ask that question. Was there, in the story that Philip Racek played, a dead man under the bed? Even though not a word about this ever appeared on his screen. How do we even answer such a question? That, I think, is where we need to start talking about fictional truth. So, what is fictional truth? Well, take for example the claim that Hercule Poirot, the famous detective from the stories of Agatha Christie, was born in Belgium. Strictly speaking, it can't be true that Poirot was born in Belgium. After all, Poirot never existed, so he was never born, and so he can't have been born in Belgium. And yet there is a sense in which we do want to say that it's true that Poirot was born in Belgium, and a corresponding sense in which we want to say that it's false that he was born in France, much to the surprise of many of the people he meets. It is this sense of true that we try to capture with the notion of fictional truth. We want to say something like, it is true in the stories, or in the world of the stories, that Poirot was born in Belgium. Philosophers have been debating for ages what fictional truth really amounts to. It's not the case that something is fictionally true just when it's explicitly stated in the text. For instance, if you have an unreliable narrator, something might be stated in the text and yet not be fictionally true. On the other hand, something could be fictionally true even though the text never explicitly states it. Suppose, for instance, that Poirot is at a party talking to people. Now, Agatha Christie may never have written that Poirot is wearing clothes, and yet surely it's fictionally true that he's not there in his birthday suit. Now, what I want to zoom in on is the idea that fictional truth is truth about a fictional world. It is quite tempting to think of fictional texts as texts that describe not our world, but some other world, a fictional or secondary world. And it's quite tempting, therefore, to think of fictional truth as being just like real truth, except that where real truth is about the real world, fictional truth is about this fictional world. So when we say that it's true that Frodo went to Mordor, what we mean is that in the secondary world created by Tolkien when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, in that secondary world, Frodo goes to Mordor. But tempting as it is, there are at least two things that create serious trouble for the idea that a fictional text could describe a fictional world, and therefore for the idea that fictional truth works just like real truth, except that it's about a different world. One source of trouble is that the real world is always determinate, or as we could also say, maximally specific. For instance, as you can see, I have some hairs on my head. Now, I don't know exactly how many hairs I have on my head, but there must be some determinate number of hairs that I have on my head. Right? Theoretically, at least, we could take them out one by one, count them, and arrive at a precise number. There must be a truth about how many hairs I have on my head. But fictional worlds are not maximally specific. It is true in the world of The Lord of the Rings that Frodo has hair on his feet. But for no specific number is it a fictional truth that Frodo has exactly that many hairs on his feet. In the same way, in the real world, every person must be male or female or non-binary. But the protagonist of 905 is neither male, nor female, nor non-binary. And not because the protagonist belongs to some mysterious further category, but because there just is no fictional truth about the gender of the protagonist in 905. And that means that fictional worlds are very strange worlds, and that fictional entities are very strange entities. The second and perhaps even more radical problem comes from the fact that the real world has to be consistent. Perhaps I will be eaten by a crocodile in the next part of this video. Or perhaps not. But it can't be the case that I am both eaten and not eaten by a crocodile in the rest of this video. Such an inconsistent state of affairs would be literally inconceivable. But a text, a work of fiction, doesn't have to be consistent. Inconsistencies may creep in by accident. For instance, when an author tells us in chapter 1 that Harry was born in 1934, and then in chapter 17 that Harry was born in 1936. But inconsistencies can also be used on purpose. Here is a simple example. On a beautiful spring day, Harry met Sally. They danced, kissed, and fell asleep together under the rose bushes. The next day, Harry woke up alone. Sally, he found out when he asked around, had been dead for 10 years. Clearly, this is an inconsistent story. If Sally is dead, she can't be spending her time dancing and kissing. To be sure, readers have been trained to try and make such a narrative consistent. Perhaps Sally was a ghost. Perhaps it was all a dream. But the text does not need to help us make the narrative consistent. In fact, it may actively resist such attempts. For instance, Vladimir Nabokov's novel Invitation to a Beheading is a book that constantly undercuts our attempts to make sense of what goes on in a way that generates a consistent fictional world. In fact, at the end of the novel, the entire fiction unravels, collapses. This is entirely intentional. The way I read Nabokov's novel, it is about the fakeness of our socially constructed reality. Clearly, when we read such a book, the idea that it reveals a fictional world to us doesn't make much sense. There is not enough consistency for there to be such a thing like a fictional world. The lesson I would like to draw from this example is that the idea that the text reveals a fictional world to us is at best an idealization, and at worst a total misrepresentation of what goes on when we are reading fiction. But now we have entered fraught ideological territory, for there definitely are those who believe that the whole point of fiction is to generate a secondary world for us, consistent and as complete as possible. I didn't pick the example of Frodo at random. Much of the not inconsiderable genius of J.R.R. Tolkien was expended towards precisely this goal of creating a secondary world that was as coherent and complete as possible. Indeed, it was Tolkien who came up with the term secondary world, as well as the term sub-creation, to describe the kind of thing he was making as an author. And generations of readers have indeed experienced his world of Middle-earth as a place you might almost visit, a place where it makes sense to ask what happens, what exists at locations that are never explicitly described in the books themselves. In other words, generations of readers have experienced Tolkien's Middle-earth as a coherent and complete fictional world that the books reveal to us. The legacy of Tolkien is enormous. Indeed, I have no doubt that he is the single most influential author of fiction writing in the 20th century. Every time you see fans, maybe fans of Star Wars, fans of Harry Potter, fans of The Witcher, whatever, every time you see them discuss what is really true in their preferred fictional world, every time you see them discuss questions of canonicity, you are seeing people who move squarely within the ideology of Tolkien. Every time fans are angry because a new book or game or film or whatever contradicts the supposed canon, you are seeing people who wish to diminish creative freedom in the name of the ideology of the secondary world. There is, of course, a competing ideology, and I'd like to introduce that using the words of fantasy and science fiction author M. John Harrison. Harrison wrote the following about the Tolkienian way of writing in a blog post I'll link to below the video. Here's what he writes. Representational techniques are used to validate the invention, with the idea of providing a secondary creation for the reader to inhabit, but also in a sense as an excuse or alibi for the act of making things up, as if to legitimize an otherwise questionable activity. This kind of world building actually undercuts the best and most exciting aspects of fantastic fiction, subordinating the uncontrolled, the intuitive, and the authentically imaginative to the explicable, and replacing psychological, poetic, and emotional logic with the rationality of the fake. Harrison goes on to argue that this ideology of the fictional world diminishes the creative and playful aspects of reading. Rather than being invited to play with the text, perhaps achieving strange and unexpected results, the reader is supposed to just accept a predetermined truth that was established by the author. And the author, instead of being a human communicating with other humans, is presented as a kind of omnipotent and omniscient God of their fictional world. Here is Harrison again. Reading was always active. The text itself always demanded the reader's interaction if the fiction was to be brought forth. There was always a game being played between writers and readers who knew they were gaming a system and who were delighted to engage each other on those terms. World building is the province of people who, like Tolkien, actually resist the idea it's a game and have installed their secondary creation concept as an aggressive defense of that position. The way that Harrison frames the issue, then, is as a conflict between two ways of experiencing fiction. On the one hand, there's the idea that the text is primarily a way for a reader and an author to engage in a creative, game-like process, the results of which can be highly unexpected, not just for the reader, but also for the author. On the other hand, there's the idea that a text reveals to us a truth that was created by the author, a truth that is, to some extent, sacrosanct and has to be treated with respect. For Harrison, this is not just an aesthetic issue, it's also a political one, pitting a progressive against a conservative ideal of reading. Now, perhaps you think that he is taking things too far, that if Tolkien heard this, he would say, "Ah, no, all I wanted to do was tell a nice story." If that's what you're thinking, you're wrong. I have here for you a quotation from Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia, in which he explicitly first dismisses the ideal of progress and then goes on to present himself as a little god wielding a little golden scepter over his own subcreation. I quote, "I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends. I will not tread your dusty path and flat, denoting this and that by this and that, your world immutable, wherein no part the little maker has with maker's art. I bow not yet before the iron crown, nor cast my own small golden scepter down." I don't want to insist here that Harrison is right and that the Tolkienian position is mistaken, although I must admit that debates about canonicity, did Han shoot first, was Dumbledore gay, are almost incomprehensible to me. So yeah, deep down, I think Harrison is totally right and Tolkien is totally wrong. But for now, what I want us to be aware of is that when we read a text as if it reveals a secondary world, we are making a choice. We are choosing one among several ways of engaging with the fiction. And it's a way of engaging with the fiction that won't be able to do justice to every text. For instance, you're not going to get much out of Nabokov's Invitation to a Beheading if you're trying to construct a coherent secondary world from the text in front of you. You're also not going to get much enjoyment from Harrison's own Viriconium series which often and deliberately breaks consistency. Let's go back to 905. What changes about our conception of fictional truth when we move from traditional fiction to interactive fiction? Well, one important change is that in interactive fiction, often different things can happen. In 905, it is not strictly speaking true that the burglar gets caught, and it is not strictly speaking true that the burglar escapes. Rather, what is true is that either of these can happen depending on what the player does. It's only after it has happened, after the player has interacted with the fiction, that one of these possibilities can be said to be true. So when we talk about interactive fiction, the notion of fictional truth seems to apply more to an individual playthrough than to the work itself, which in turn means that interaction with the player, interaction with the reader, is built into our notion of fictional truth in interactive fiction at the most foundational level. But if the existence of multiple paths through the game may weaken the idea of fictional truth or a secondary world in interactive fiction, there's another aspect of IF, especially of parser-based IF, that strengthens the idea of a secondary world. And this is the fact that most parser-based IF actually gives the player a model world, a world that they inhabit, a world that they have to act in, a world that reacts to them. It is a central conceit of parser-based interactive fiction that you have to experiment with the world around you in order to learn how it works and then be able to act successfully within its confines. And of course, that's a way of experiencing fiction that fits perfectly with this ideology of the secondary world. Be that as it may, the author of a parser game has all the freedom that the author of traditional fiction has. She can use just as much ambiguity and inconsistency as a Nabokov or a Harrison. When we play an interactive fiction game, we know we are engaging in an exchange between a player and an author. And how far we want to take that dimension of play and in which directions, that is something that is our choice as a community. So let's return to our original question. Did Philip Racek play, without noticing, a story about a criminal who got away with his crime? Or did he play a story about a guy who was fed up with his job and then drove away into the sunset? Well, if you love the idea of secondary worlds, if you're in the Tolkien camp, you'll lean towards the first answer. You will want to claim that there really was a corpse underneath the bed, even if Philip never noticed it. You'll want to claim that the secondary world was Adam Cadre's to create and ours to explore. And if Philip failed to explore certain parts of it, then that couldn't change Adam Cadre's creation. But if you are more of a Harrisonian thinker, you will hold the opposite opinion, that there was no corpse, or rather that it's not true that there was a corpse, since no corpse ever appeared in the exchange between Cadre and Racek, and fictional truth is something that happens in the exchange between author and reader. And no doubt you will delight, like I do, in this unexpected possibility that sometimes 905 is not the story of a burglar. That there are fictional truths in this program that even its author, Adam Cadre, did not anticipate. The fact that interactivity in fiction can generate a richness of possibility that may surprise even the author is surely one of the things that makes IF so fascinating.